All right, we're in Romans chapter 14. The first two questions are going to be taken together. What does the person who is weak eat is the first. The second, what does the other person eat? Verse 2 answers both questions. One man's faith allows him to eat everything, but another man whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The weak person eats only vegetables, the other eats anything. The third question is who is right before God? These seem to be exclusive. It seems that only one can be right and the other one must be wrong. But Paul seems to say that both are right before God. They're both right before God. And this is just in the very next verse. The man who eats everything must not look down on him who does not. And the man who does not eat everything must not condemn the man who does. This last phrase, for God has accepted him. It seems he's saying God has accepted both of them, and neither should think less of the other because of their decision. That isn't to say that both are right on the issue, which of course is a logical impossibility. Skipping down, Paul gives his position on it. In verse 14, he says, as one who is in the Lord Jesus, I am fully convinced that no food is unclean in itself. So he's of the opinion that everything is acceptable. Now I want to quickly make a note on what I believe the context of this passage is referring to. When we read it in our 21st century mindset, we're thinking maybe of the debate of clean food and unclean food. Is that still binding in the New Testament? Or we're thinking even of vegetarianism, which is a more modern issue. I do want to mention the reasons that, one of the main reasons I believe that this is not talking about either of those. Some of the reasons are that this chapter, Romans 14, is very similar in content and in many of the phrases that Paul uses to 1 Corinthians chapters 8 and the latter part of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And in both of those, he's explicitly talking about food sacrificed to idols. I'll just go ahead and read 1 Corinthians 8, verse 1. Now about food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And he continues the rest of that chapter addressing the issue of food sacrificed to idols. But again, as I mentioned, he uses some of the same logic and some of the same wording even. In verse 7, but not everyone knows this. Some people who are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat such food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to an idol, and since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. And so again, the same idea that we saw in Romans 14 about a weak person, not that they're weak morally or physically, but they're weak in conscience, seems to be what Paul is referring to here. And again, there are many other ways of showing connection between 1 Corinthians 8 and Romans 14, as well as the latter part of 1 Corinthians 10, which also explicitly is referring to food sacrificed to idols. Just a brief overview of this concept. As an act of worship, individuals would offer food, meat, or even bread or other things to the idol. They would come in as an act of worship, they would present them to the idol. And then after presenting it in worship to the idol, or killing it, if it's an animal, killing the animal and offering it before the idol, they would eat a portion of that meat. Some of it probably would be burnt on the altar, and some of it would be eaten by the worshiper. And so that was an act of fellowship with that idol, or fellowship with that God. This concept is alluded to in 1 Corinthians 10. As I mentioned, this is also similar in context. Paul says, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 20. No, but the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God. And I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You cannot have part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons. So the idea of this food sacrificed to idol is like eating a meal with the idol, eating a meal with the God that you're worshiping. This same concept was used with the children of Israel. Of course, they were offering it to God and not to an idol. In Leviticus chapter 3 and also in Leviticus chapter 7, we see the regulations for having a fellowship or a peace offering, in which a portion of the meal would be burned on the altar as being offered to God, and a portion would be eaten by the worshiper. Again, this is the idea of food sacrificed to a deity in the case of the children of Israel, but this was the same way with food sacrificed to idols. The issue facing the first century church was that many of the idol worshippers, among whom they were living, would offer the food to the idol And then they would have the leftover stored somewhere. Either they're stored in their house, and then when visitors come over their house, they would give them some of they would put some of the meat on the table because it was left over from the idol. Also, another problem would be the leftover meat from these acts of worship would be often sold in the meat markets. We see this alluded to also in 1 Corinthians 10. Paul, after a while addressing this issue, says in verse 25, "Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience." Again, this was the problem they were facing. Should we eat what's sold in the meat market because it may have been sacrificed to idols? And Paul is saying, go ahead and eat it and don't worry about it. But again, this is the matter that was contemporary for them, not the contemporary issues that we face in talking about food and what's right before God. But this is the issue I believe that Paul is referring to in Romans chapter 14. And it is this issue that I believe he's saying the one who's weak eats only vegetables because they're afraid to eat any meat because the meat that they're eating may have been sacrificed to an idol. But Paul says he doesn't believe it's a problem because if the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, which he refers to in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, then whether it's sacrificed to an idol or not, those who know that there's only one God and only one Lord should not have a problem with that. But getting away from the issue itself and the details of that, most of us in our Western context don't face this issue. So what principles can we draw from this? And this is what I want to focus on in this video. The principle here is that there is an issue that two Christians may have entirely opposite views on. And Paul is saying that both can be right before God. And he uses this logic. He says, "Who are you," in verse 4, "to judge someone else's servant?" So the idea is that all Christians are servants of Jesus. And this one Christian who believes this way is doing this because he's fine with it before his master Jesus. And this Christian doing something entirely different is fine in doing it before his master Jesus. And Paul is saying both are right because they are both serving their master as they understand him. Paul used in Romans chapter 7 the example of marriage to describe the relationship between Christians and Christ. And I think that's a very good example of a way to understand this concept. My marriage, I've been married almost 6 years now. And earlier in my marriage, just like most husbands, most even boyfriends, I used to buy flowers for my wife. But now it's been probably 3, maybe 4 years since I've ever bought her flowers, And now you looking on, you may assume that I'm just a complacent husband now. We've been married so long, I don't care about being nice to my wife anymore. And other people looking on would say, wow, how is it that you don't buy flowers for your wife? And also myself looking at other husbands, I may think, wow, maybe I should buy flowers. But what you don't know is that I've learned in the years of being with my wife that she doesn't like flowers. She just doesn't find them to be important or significant. It doesn't really mean anything to her. She didn't really tell me earlier in our marriage, but eventually she came around to telling me that. And now I know that. And so based on my knowledge of that, I'm serving her in a different way than even I used to, or in a different way than other husbands serve their wives. And this is the situation we find here, that according to the knowledge that one individual has, they believe that their master can be served by eating only vegetables. And the opposite is true for the one who eats everything. And what Paul's saying is most important is in the end of verse 5. He says, each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. Because if you're doing it just because I saw another husband give flowers to his wife and I don't want to be embarrassed because I'm not giving any flowers to my wife, that's not out of love for my wife. I need to be serving her in harmony with what I'm fully convinced will please her. I need to be doing that to show that's a true, genuine affection, a display of my affection and love for her. And so again, this principle I believe that Paul is emphasizing is that Christians must be true to their own conscience according to the knowledge they have of what Jesus' will is for them. The fourth question says, how can a person who is right on the issue itself still be wrong? And this is, again, going down to verse 13. He says, therefore let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put a stumbling block or obstacle in your brother's way. Even if you're right on the issue, If you're exercising what you're free to do, exercising what you know to be right in a way that is offensive, intentionally offensive to another Christian brother, you can still be wrong. Number 5 says, give at least one example of an area that we can apply these principles today. I'll give an example that's probably not too controversial, just for the sake of the video. There are some people who believe that it's right, or there could be some people, I don't know if this is true really, that it's right before God, that it's only acceptable to come to worship God with a suit and a tie. Let's say that's the case, that there are people who believe that. And let's say that these people invite me to come to their church to speak for a worship service. And I go to their worship service knowing that they feel it is right before God to come to worship only with a jacket and a suit and a tie. But I don't believe that. I believe, which I do believe, that it's not a matter of importance to God whether I come with a shirt and tie. I believe God is more concerned with what I have, how my heart is adorned. So I have the choice here to go to that church and intentionally offend their conscience, to go up on the pulpit and not wear a tie or not even wear a jacket. And I could do that knowing that before God, this is not an important thing, but also knowing that these individuals who I'm speaking to may be offended. What's very interesting is that someone there may be moved by my message and think that somehow I'm a strong Christian. And so because of that, they may decide, well, if he doesn't wear a tie and a suit, then I don't need to do one either. But their reason for deciding is not because they've studied the Bible and believe that God is not concerned with the outward appearance and God is more concerned with the heart. It's because they're seeing me do it. And if they act based on that, they are wrong before God, because they're not serving their master now. They're not doing what is right, what they know to be right, based on their knowledge of their master. They're doing what they saw someone else's relationship with their master. Again, in my marriage analogy, it would be like me feeling my wife, knowing my wife does not like flowers, but I see another husband, or I see people looking at me strange because I'm not giving her flowers, and so I'm going to give her flowers just because of that. It has nothing to do with my relationship with her. And similarly, in the example, if an individual decides to change their position based on someone else's relationship, that is wrong. And furthermore, I am wrong who does this, because in verse 15, if your brother is distressed because of what you eat, you are no longer acting in love. If I did that intentionally, knowing that the people at this church would be offended by this, I am no longer acting in love. Now, this is a kind of a big concept, and these are just some basic principles. I can't think to explain all of it. I don't fully understand all the applications of this principle, but I just want to share some of the thoughts that I believe Romans 14 is expressing on this. Please make sure to watch the next video, which will be including some thoughts from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, which is a balancing passage for this concept. Hope you enjoy it.